If the Chinese admit to themselves that they're facing demographic, economic, agriculture, and trade crises all at once that will tear their system down, and I think they do realize that, then there's something to be said for picking the time and the place of a war, even if you know you're going to lose, because it lets you write the narrative, even if it's one of national failure. And if you're facing a deindustrialization collapse, that might allow the CCP to persist as a political ruler of the system into whatever's next. And so if you can guarantee your personal power for the low cost of 300 to 500 million dead Chinese from famine, that might be worth the cost.
So
make no mistake, this is not a war of expansion. I'm really not worried about the United States. So number one, we have the best demography in the advanced world and a better demography than most of the developing world. At current rates of aging, we will be younger on average than the Mexicans, the Indians, the Indonesians, and the Brazilians at some point in the early 2050s. We became younger on average than the Chinese over a decade ago. In addition, the United States created global trade, and one of the conditions in order to induce countries to join our security network was that we wouldn't take advantage of that. So as a percent of GDP, we are the least involved with the major economies in the world, and most of our economic integration is with Mexico and Canada. That's like almost half of our total. So if you factor that out, as a percent of GDP, our total exposure to the entire world is less than 10% of GDP, and a big chunk of that has to do with the shale revolution and energy exports. Take that out, you slim it down even more. Our weakness in, also we're the world's largest producer of oil and the world's largest producer and exporter of foodstuffs. Our biggest weakness is in electronics manufacture. And if China were to disappear tomorrow, yeah, that's going to be a pain in the ass. We're going to have to rebuild that from scratch. We're going to have to double the size of the industrial plant over the course of the next 5 years. And if you think we have an inflation problem now, just wait till we lose access to Chinese goods and we have to build out our own system. But that will generate the fastest economic growth in the history of our country. And when it is done, we will have more reliable partners closer to home with shorter supply chains that use less energy and use workers that are local and sell to consumers that are local. This is a good story. The hardest part of geopolitics, especially demography, is timing.
Yeah.
One of the problems with one of the problems with demography is this has never happened before. We've never had global aging. What I've described for China is an extreme case, but it's happening everywhere. So n equals 0 historically for points of comparison.
Right.
The reason why this is the decade that I think it's really going to go down is this is the decade where not just China, but a lot of other countries literally age into mass retirement.
And this is pretty
much
much
no longer enough people under 30 to even theoretically repopulate.
This is pretty much what happened to Japan, right? I mean, in the 80s, everybody thought Japan was going to take over the world, and then all of a sudden, Japan fell off the map.
Absolutely. Part of that was a debt issue, which the Chinese had actually a bigger debt issue. Part of it is demographic. But the two big differences between the Japanese and the Chinese. Japan saw this coming 30 years ago and took steps to boost their birth rate and relocate industrial plant to better locations like the United States. They're as prepared as they can be.
Right.
China's done none of that. I'm far more concerned about the consequences of the Chinese collapse than any sort of war.
Okay.
I think from most points of view, it's been a success. So from the American point of view, it was a security program to prevent war in Europe and a nuclear exchange. And in that, it created the greatest alliance in history. And that is why even the Germans today are, shockingly with the program on the Russians. From an economic point of view, we expanded the population to 8 billion people, and it's the wealthiest the world has ever been, the safest the world has ever been, the most healthy the world has ever been. So I don't mean to suggest it's all been good, but it has been a really good run, historically speaking.
And now it's just not working because of the COVID breakdown, or it's just not useful anymore?
COVID definitely sped up the decline, but from the American point of view, you use the right word. It's no longer useful. We created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets, and the Soviets are gone. And even with the Russians kind of having this moment All of the security deals that the Biden administration is striking with everyone around the world are just that. They're security. There's no economic side to it. We are not interested in the United States strategically or politically in a Bretton Woods 2.0. It's just not happening. But most importantly, that demographic aging that industrialization and urbanization created has now passed the point of no return, so that this specific economic model is on its last legs, independent of what we might think politically. We're going to have to come up with something new. And that means countries with better geographies and better demographic structures are going to have their day. And the United States is at the very top of that very short list.
All right. So
let me give you three things. Number one, in the United States, our political system is going through its once-a-generation reshuffling, where the factions that make up the parties move around. And the business community was kicked out of the Republican coalition by Donald Trump, so they are kind of in the wilderness. So any sort of international finance or business connections that we may have had at one point are no longer within the political decision-making apparatus. So there is not really a lobbying group within the United States for globalization in general. Second, anything that involves the United Nations that is not the Security Council is incapable of pushing the agenda forward at all, because it doesn't have the political support of the countries that matter. So I would put that to the side completely. And then third, the World Economic Forum crowd. I think it's most useful to think of Klaus Schwab as a DJ who throws a really big party once a year that everyone wants to go to. And it's nothing more than that. Yes, they've got their seminars, but mostly this is rich people doing the equivalent of body shots. And the countries that have the ability to go it their own way, places like the United States or Japan or France, just don't swim in that pond. That is something that requires policy shifts, not at the global or even the national level, but mostly at the local. And for this, the United States is really well set up. One of the major things about globalization was it created a economic and security structure globally that allowed countries that, historically speaking, hadn't been able to play the game to play the game, because no longer did they have to worry about defending themselves or their trade routes, and they could access a world full of markets and resources as if they had won World War II. For most of the world, it was great. But if you had a good geography to begin with, that put you at a severe disadvantage, because all of a sudden there was all this indirectly subsidized competition. That competition is now going away. And a lot of the global industrial build-out that we have seen over the last 75 years, which gave birth to some of the political movements that you've just identified, that is breaking down, leaving it to the places that are more functional geographically and demographically to do really well. And so for the United States, not only is that most of our territory, we are also a federalized system where the localities and the state governments have just as much power as the federal government. So state governments and localities who are